As the anonymous psalmist sang and wrote and prayed that Psalm 148, it's important that we come together and understand that we really can do what that praise was all about, which is to believe and to praise God for being the Creator. That idea that we see in Genesis 1:1 that God created all of the heavens and the earth, it's important. It's particularly important if you think about the things that go on in the culture around us. If I were to try to argue a case with you on anything, and let's say we were to go into a court situation, or we were to just have an argument at all, if you were to have an opening statement, and I could show that your opening statement was absolutely false, or that your opening statement was, in fact, in some manner trying to persuade people the wrong way, if I could prove that that was the case, everything else that you would say would be null and void. Would you agree with that? And so I would say to you that Genesis 1:1 that says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," if we were to try and attack God or get rid of what He has to say, wouldn't it make sense that we would attack the very first line and then say, why read the rest? If the rest must be fake if it begins with something that's false, and we know that that's the way that it goes. And so we see that this is a very obvious attack and has been for a long time. This one sentence, under attack, been thrown around in so many ways, laughed at in other ways, but I think it's a purposeful effort to deceive the world. It's a purposeful effort to make us really just believe that there's no creation, there's no purpose, there's no God. And if there's no God, then there's no morality, there's no point, there's no one to answer to, no accountability. We're just accidental beasts competing to exist in the world. This is what the world tells us, but God does exist, and we can absolutely know it. You don't have to wonder. You can know that God is real and that He is alive. And so tonight what I want to do is simply make a case for you for faith and reason. I want to make a case for you that faith is actually reasonable and that you can be an intelligent, rational thinking person and believe in God and believe that He created. I know this is one of the things you guys have been talking about here for a while, talking about Lee Strobel's stuff on the case for Creator, and that's great. I've gotten to meet Lee and spend some time with him, and he's a really brilliant guy, but he's totally wrong in a couple of areas. And I would say that right in front of him. In fact, I did one time. And it was okay. And so, but Lee has some great stuff, and I love what he's done with that book. And I'm so excited and thankful that you all are taking that on and looking at it and digging through it and trying to know and understand, because it's important. It's important for lots of different reasons. And so I want to spend some time talking about why that's so important. And so my name is Spencer Dunlap. I guess I'm the capable teacher that Patrick has been telling you about. And so I'm a pastor of a church called Renew Community Church in a place called Cabot, Arkansas. And so you can find me there if you really need to and have questions. I'm a Restoration Movement guy. Went to seminary at Pepperdine. However, I started out as a biologist, and so that story is long and convoluted, but the short side of it is, started out as a borderline agnostic evolutionary biology guy. As I was studying genetics, went, there is absolutely no possible way this is accidental, which was good because my wife, who is over here now, as she and I have been married for 23 years, but we were unequally yoked in the beginning. She begged me to go to church. I would make fun of church, and I would make fun of the pastor and everybody else sitting in the crowd. Doesn't God have a sense of humor? Here we are. And so that's how that goes sometimes. And I didn't want to go. I thought it was ridiculous. But as we studied genetics, I looked deeper and went, there's absolutely a creation aspect here. There has to be design. There has to be a designer. And I began asking questions to my professors, and they primarily just told me to shut up. They would curse at me at times, tell me to go talk to my priest if I had issues. I said, I'm not a religious guy, I don't have a priest, I'm just a scientist. You've been training me to ask questions, that's all I'm doing. And they would yell at me and say terrible things, and I would think to myself, if that guy who has a PhD in evolutionary biology won't answer a simple question, I must be onto something. And I'll go deeper and further and press harder. Although at one point in time I wasn't sure they were going to actually let me graduate because I'd caused so much trouble asking questions. You know, people don't like to hear truth in that, and they don't like to be confronted with truth at times. And so as I would ask questions that they knew they could not answer, which is ultimately the reason they reacted so violently and angrily toward me, it made it very clear that there must be something here. And so I became a Christian and worked in the science field for a few years and taught school and some different things. And it's a longer story than we have time for tonight. And it's not really important to the topic that we have in mind, but at some point determined, I think I want to go and spend all of my time doing these things, and went to seminary, and God had us plant a church in Cabot, Arkansas about 5 years ago, and it's been an amazing adventure. And so I'm so thankful to get a little bit of time with you tonight. I'm going to try to talk through some important things, but ultimately what I want to do is give you some time to ask some questions, because I'm sure that you will have some, and I may not have the answer to it, but if I don't, I'll tell you the truth and say I don't know. Is that fair? Is that okay? All right. And so, but I want to cover some important ground that will help you. And this is important for lots of reasons. It's important because, again, this topic has a propensity to get people thinking, well, there must not be a God. Science has proven that life arose spontaneously by chance. There's no God, there's no creator, you're just an accident. Of course, people think that all the time. The textbooks are written this way. I'm going to address textbooks here in just a moment. But it's just not the case. The science absolutely, 100%, points to order and complexity and design, and random mutational events are not the designer. And so we need to talk through that and make sure that we understand what's going on here. And so, one of the reasons I like to talk about this topic is because salvation ultimately hangs in the balance. You know, if the world were a village of 100 people, 67 would be living far from God and facing a Christless eternity. I'm not okay with that. God is also not okay with that. And you can see that in 2 Peter 3:9 and other places. God does not want anyone to perish. We know that. But part of what that means for us then is that we, the church, need to be able to communicate truth. Now, we want to communicate truth in love, which is always the balancing act. But knowing truth is really key. And so we want to be able to communicate truth to people and to be able to address the questions that come up, whether it's to our children and our grandchildren, or whether it's to a neighbor or a friend or whomever, or the next time you watch a nature show, which I barely can stand to do because I want to throw up in my mouth just a little bit every time I watch one, because the science is so dramatically bad. But when I do watch them because of pretty pictures, you just hit mute and it makes it all right. And just watch the pictures. But we do need to be able to address the questions that come up, and you can. You can. And so my hope, though, is that you might take a note or two, because we're going to talk about some important things that you will want to remember, I think, rather than, yeah, I heard some guy one time, once upon a time, said something about that, but I have no idea, but it was good. You know, and you're talking about, you know, Patrick and Marshall. But I don't want that for you. I want you to actually know it and to be a seeker of truth and to go and see what it is that God has in mind. And so I would say to you, let's reason together. Let's really make sure that we do a good job and understand what's going on here. There is a lot at stake. You know, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 also says something very interesting. It is the apologetics, which ultimately what I'm doing is defending the faith from a scientific and theological perspective, which is generally my favorite thing to do. But it's this idea of defense of the faith, which is apologia. That's where you get this term apologetics from. But apologia is this: be ready to give a defense for the hope that is in you. Now, forever, people have looked at that verse and they've said, you know, what that really means is you need to know all the science and all the archaeology and history. And I agree with that. It's beautiful, but it's actually not what the text says. What the text says is be ready to give a defense for the hope that's in you. And if we're a hopeless bunch, then why would anyone want to be a Christian? We need to live a life of hope. Part of that, though, is what happens in our faith, and as we grow to know who Christ is, and as we understand what it is that Christ has done, hopefully our faith will grow, our hope will grow, and we absolutely know that when we leave this earth, that there's something better on its way. But with that hope, then we can live with hope now, too. Knowing what's to come, it gives us hope here, but that means living a life of hope, so people look at you and go, something's different about you, what is it? Be ready to give a defense for that. And I think this is one of those things that helps us to do that, to be able to share what we know. And so again, I want to make a case for you, basically from science, but also theology, that God's very much alive, and that He is at work, and has been at work, and has lots to say to us. And so let's start with this then, with John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is a continuation really from Genesis 1:1, that in the beginning God created. So we get to John 1:1, and we have this idea. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we get down to verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we've seen His glory, glory as of the only begotten Son. By the way, that word begotten is important. Don't miss that one. Some of the new translations love to miss it. That monogenes word in Greek there means the unique one. Now, it's not the one and only. Why? Because we're called sons and daughters. It's a bad translation of monogenes. Monogenes is unique, the unique Son. This is the one who has always been. And this is part of what John 1:1 tells us, that Jesus from the Father, full of grace and truth. And this truth, again, is none other than Jesus Himself. Jesus is the Creator. And this is what we see here. We need to understand who He is, the Son of the living God. Matthew 16 talks about that. So in the beginning was the Word was Jesus. And by the power of this Word, the power of His Word, He created. It was no accident. You are no accident. You have purpose, and I am proud of you for wanting to know what that is. And so, although I don't have time to make an entire case for you, because it would take me hours to do so, the good news is you're in this class. Keep coming. Keep coming. Bring your friends. Let them continue to teach you. Seek it outside of just a class that you come to at church. Be a seeker of truth so that you will know and be able to communicate it in love. Because we are fighting a war. And I'm guessing that probably all of you would agree with that. We live in a very dark, spiritually dark place. It's a real war, all kinds of stuff. It's a war of skepticism and disbelief all around us. And we need to be able to be the light in our community. You need to be light to your neighbors and to your friends, to your family. And so one of the greatest weapons against all of that is to be able to tell the truth. But one of the greatest weapons that skeptics like to use to say that you're silly for believing in God is evolution. It is this idea of evolution that has become so strong in our society that is accepted as the norm. And so we need to make sure that we have good definitions for it. So Harcourt, Brace, and Jovanovich, which is a textbook I actually taught out of many, many years ago, it defined evolution simply as change in living things over time. That is the silliest definition of evolution I've ever heard in my life. But if you define something as generically as possible, then it's always true. Would you make sense? Does that make sense to you? And so if you define something so generically that it's impossible for it to not be true, then you can make your case every time. Here's the deal. If I were to cut my fingernails later, that is a change in living things over time. Or let's take it worse. I cut my arm off in an accident. Is that a change in a living thing over time? I've gotten older. My beard's getting more and more gray, getting a little pudgy around the middle. Is that a change in living things over time? You can tell the truth. Go ahead and smile at me. You know it's true. And you haven't known me very long. It's a change in a living thing over time. Does that mean I'm evolving right in front of your face? No. It just means that Harcourt, Brace, and Jovanovich like to define things as generically as possible so they're always right. And so it's not a good definition. Really, a good definition, a scientific definition, is that it's a theory. And by the way, you can never prove something about the origins of life. The scientific method necessitates that to prove something, you have to be able to experiment and observe. Well, no one would have been around in the beginning of time, so it is absolutely impossible to experiment and observe, or observe and experiment. So therefore, no theory of origins could ever become a law. No, it could never be a scientific law. However, if you read the textbooks, they write them as if they are a law. For instance, if I were teaching a longer class to you, one of the things I would do is bring a stack of different textbooks I've collected over the years. We turn to a couple different chapters, and I go, read for me the first line of the chapter on evolution, and it would say something like, we know we evolved from ape-like ancestors, blah, 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 blah. Well, we know is the language of law, not theory. And of course they can't do that because they can't observe it or experiment on it. And so the first understanding is it's a theory by which nature continually improves itself through gradual and accidental or mutational development. The reality is the only mechanism really for evolution is for an organism to mutate. It is for its genetic code to be messed up along the way. The problem with that is that in order for evolution to really occur, in order for us to go from a more simplistic animal to a more complex one, you need increasing genetic material. But mutations take genetics away. They don't improve them. Now you have some, if we were debating this, some would say yes, but there are some mutations that are positive, although almost all the time, they're 99 point something, negative and bad, mutations are. They'd say, well, yeah, what about sickle cell anemia? That's a mutation. It is. It makes your normally red blood cells that are round and they're like little donuts floating around and spinning past each other, and they work very well that way. But a sickle cell anemia means the red blood cell is shaped like a sickle. And so they get stuck and it causes pain and lifespan is not as long. Ultimately, it's not a positive mutation. Although it makes it harder to get malaria, it's still not considered a positive thing. So the primary mechanism for evolution to occur is a mutation. But guess what? It takes away genetic material. It doesn't add genetic material, and most mutations are lethal anyway. So here's really the definition of evolution. Evolution is really the imaginary process by which nature developed and develops in complexity. And you don't have to take my word for it. In fact, it may surprise you to know that not all scientists are atheists. It may surprise you to know that not all scientists are evolutionists. And it may surprise you even more to know that not all evolutionists believe in evolution. And so let me tell you their story. And so, how about this one by F. Clark Howell, who is a very well-known evolutionary biologist. There is no encompassing theory of human evolution. There never really has been. Now, that's kind of an interesting thought. So if you look at the picture up there at the top, we've got the Lucy fraud, which is a fraud. And then you continue on with all these different... You've all seen this picture, no doubt, right? It's totally make-believe. It just doesn't exist anywhere. It's just... once upon a time kind of stuff. It is a fairy tale. But if you put together enough things and you use enough big words, which I'll use some tonight, but then I'll define them for you. But if I were to say to you, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, you obviously cannot argue the point. And you would go, you're right, because I don't know what language you're speaking. And scientists have grown accustomed to using words that no one knows, and therefore you can't argue something if you can't even understand what they're talking about. And so most of the time, this is the kind of thing you see, uh-oh, I did a bad thing. There we go, thank goodness, I pushed the wrong button. I think that one is the one I wanted. And so when you begin to look at pictures like that, it's just make-believe. But you get F. Clark Howell, who says, we really have never had an encompassing theory of human evolution. The reality is that a lot of what you find in textbooks are frauds. And so you begin to look at pictures like this, and all of our textbooks that our kids read, and you have probably read, are just full of absolute, purposeful, fraudulent data. And so, for instance, you see Piltdown Man. This is supposedly one of the missing links. Right here he is. This would be a part of what they found. Piltdown Man, that is the supposed missing link, is a purposeful fraud. In fact, what we found... Oh, and it took decades and decades and decades to find it, is that they actually had the top end of the skull and an orangutan jaw, and the scientists that found it filed down the jaw so it would fit in with the skull and said, look, here it is. And often, and this is not the first time that's happened, it's happened many times, they'll acid wash the bones and stain them so they look the same, and they'll go, see, look at the big giant jaw or look at the big giant forehead. This is proof that it is the missing link. This is our textbooks that we know, by the way, are fraudulent, and still in textbooks they print today. And we've known they were frauds for decades and decades and decades and decades, and they continue to print them. How about Nebraska Man? They found one tooth in a bone graveyard, and out of the one tooth, they created an entire species of ape to man, and they built the entire body around them. It was amazing. Out of one tooth, they built how the skull would have looked, what their eyes would have looked like, how the sockets would have been, how far apart they were, whether they were bipedal or quadrupeds. They created all of this out of one tooth. And then someone along the line got smart and tested it and found out that it was actually a pig tooth. It wasn't even human. And yet we still see Nebraska Man in some of our textbooks, or Java Man. They found a human femur in the skull cap of a giant gibbon. They found a piece of bone about that big that would have fit right here, and they created an entire skull, an entire species from one femur bone and one piece of skull. Orc Man, they found a piece of skull that was over here, and they found out later it was from a donkey. You can make your own jokes now. There you go. I made my own joke. And so you have a donkey that they made an entire species of transitional forms. Ernst Haeckel's drawings, this was 1874. This is one of my favorites. Now, remember I used that phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. This is what it is in textbooks. Here's the idea. There's the pig tooth, by the way, that they found. They created an entire species. This diagram right here, it is Ernst Haeckel's famous drawings from the 1800s. Basically what he said was, since we all evolved from common ancestors, that means that pigs and fish and chickens and humans all are going to, in utero, go through the stages of their evolutionary ancestors. In other words, we're all going to go through a fish stage, an amphibian stage, a reptile stage, a bird stage, and eventually become a whatever, a mammal at the end. And so he said in embryo, you can see all of these very clear stages. And so what he did was he drew these pictures of different organisms that would look like one another in this case. Well, guess what? It's a fraud. These are hand-drawn pictures in order to prove ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In other words, that we go through our evolutionary ancestors' stages in utero, and they're make-believe. In fact, once we got to a point where we could actually take these organisms out and take pictures of them, they look completely different. They don't look like this at all. And so we've known that Ernst Haeckel's drawings were a fraud for like 80 years or so. And guess what? Still in textbooks. And they're not even close. But they use it to try and I took a comparative vertebrate anatomy class in my undergraduate biology program, and this is one of the things we spent forever on, talking about how we go through our evolutionary ancestors, but the truth is, it's just fraud. It's just fraud. And so, let's see, I had another drawing in here. I'll go to that a little bit later. How about carbon dating? I know that's been a question that comes up, and as you guys talked a little bit about Lee Strobel's material. So that one of the areas I disagree with Lee on is that I'm not an old Earth guy. I started out that way. When I was going through my exploration of science, I went through all sorts of different seasons and phases of that belief system where in the beginning I thought, well, maybe God sparked it and it all evolved from there. Or maybe there was a ruin reconstruction kind of theory where there was all this creation from God, and then with the fall of Satan it all fell apart, and then it kind of evolved back from there, but all the mechanisms were in place. And so it had all these differing views. Let me say a couple things to you. Number one, I believe that God is powerful enough to speak light into existence. That in the beginning God spoke and there was light. I believe that's true. But if I believe that's true, then I have to believe that God's powerful enough to create in a nanosecond if He wanted to. And I do believe that. I don't think you have to get hung up in, well, a day is like 1,000 years. By the way, that biblical understanding is way out of context in this. And you guys could do a Bible study on that and see that that's not what the point of that passage is. But the idea is that if things on day 2 needed to exist for 1,000 years without day 3, it wouldn't work. Or if they were eons of time or any of those things. But there's all kinds of evidence that would suggest, I think, that the Earth is relatively young. Now, this was not necessarily a part of what I put together in a PowerPoint for you, so let me just give you a couple of examples, and you can go and look it up for yourself. I think comets are one of the greatest examples of a young Earth. For instance, the Big Bang would have been the only mechanism to create a comet. And so if you would believe in a Big Bang idea, so let's go backwards and talk about that for just a moment, and then I'll come back to the comets. The theory of the Big Bang is that all the matter of the entire universe would be compacted down into a mass the size of a pea or a football, depending on what scientist you're reading. At some point it met some critical mass point and it explodes, and matter is hurled out across the universe in every direction. It begins to slow down and congeal, and it forms all the creative order around us. Now, the problem ultimately that I have with that, of course, is the first law of thermodynamics. So now we're into physics. The first law of thermodynamics says energy is neither created nor destroyed, so there's an issue with where did the thing come from, and there's no answer for that. And even if this were a debate scenario, and I would have a loving friend with me who would be an atheistic evolutionist or something, they still can't answer that question, and they don't want to. They would argue open systems versus closed systems, and it's just a smoke screen. The reality is, if you can't explain how the matter got there or the energy necessary to create an explosion, you don't have a theory. It's impossible to get there. So the first law of thermodynamics throws it out completely. Now, they would also say to you, well, but the laws of physics have changed over time. They can't have it both ways. They really have to believe in something called uniformitarianism, which means that the laws of physics today are the same as they've always been. They have to have that belief in order for their evolutionary mechanisms to work. The problem is that that's not the case. We can show that certain things do change, like even Einstein's theory of relativity. Guess what? Light is not a constant speed. You can change the speed of light in different ways. And so things can change, but they would say to you, yes, but all these things have changed, and again, it's just a smoke screen. The reality is you have to have some creative mechanism if it's going to be a Big Bang in the first place, which I still don't believe, because the second law of thermodynamics is the law of entropy. E-N-T-R-O-P-Y for the note takers. The law of entropy says things go from a state of order to disorder. This building, if we leave it here for 100 years and don't touch it, what will happen? It will become a skyscraper. It will be the most amazing thing you've ever seen. That's not exactly how that works. It will actually cave in. In 100 years, we don't do anything to it, the roof will cave in, the walls will fall out, and it will fall apart. We know this, right? It's called entropy. Things go from a state of order to disorder. They do not go the other way around. The evolutionary mechanism forces the other direction, which is we go from chaos and order into complexity. That's not how it works. We don't see that anywhere else in anything. There is no such thing as that. This would be akin to saying, you know, I'm kind of a mess at home. I'm not a good housekeeper. I have my own closet where I have all my stuff, and I just sort of throw stuff in there. Some would say that's what your treadmill's for. You know, you just put clothes on that. You laugh because it's true. Isn't that how that works? And so what I do every year, my wife gives me a box of hand grenades. And because like Texas, I'm down here close to you, so hand grenades for Christmas might work. And so I get a box of hand grenades. Oh, this is recorded. Hell, hello. So so you get a box of hand grenades. You pull the pin. You throw one into the closet and shut the door. And the most amazing thing happens. A couple of hours later, you come back and all the clothes are hung up. They're in order of color. My socks are matched. They're on the shelf, and all those things. It's the most amazing thing ever. You agree with that, right? Well, of course you wouldn't agree with that. Why? Because chaos does not create order. Just as in the Big Bang, it doesn't happen that way. You don't have an explosion that creates order. It's just ridiculousness. And so because of things like that, we just can believe that God spoke it into existence. Now, back to the comets. If the Big Bang were true, the only mechanism to create a comet is the Big Bang, that is leftover material. What happens is you have a mass of material that is like a slingshot. It is being pulled in by gravitational forces by a large body. Any body has gravity. So the moon has a gravitational force because it has mass. The sun has gravitational forces greater because its mass is greater. And so a comet is hurled toward the sun, and it ends up in like a slingshot effect, and it comes around it, and it gives it the energy to spin around and comes by the next thing. Well, what's interesting is a comet, you can actually measure how much of the comet tail is burned off every time it goes around the sun. And so because you can measure how much of the mass is burned off every time it goes around the sun, then you can extrapolate backwards on how big the thing must have been in the beginning of the universe. So if the universe is billions of years old, you extrapolate backwards, and guess what? That one comet is bigger than the giant supernovas, which don't go fast enough in order to get their own gravitational force from the sun, because they'd be bigger than the sun, pulling the sun into itself rather than being slingshotted by the sun. There is no mechanism for a comet other than that it was created that way. And so when you use good scientific method, you can see that the Earth would be relatively young, not old. Same thing with meteoritic dust when they landed on the moon. Some of you may not believe that they did, but when they landed on the moon, they put these big discs on the bottom of the lander. Why? Because they were afraid that it was going to sink down into the dust of the moon, because they believed through some research that we could measure how much nickel and things are in the Earth's atmosphere and in the ground, and they were making some guesses on how deep the dust would be if the moon were billions of years old, and they figured it would sink, so they put these big fat landers on it. And guess what? The dust was like that thick. What does that tell us? It tells us that this system is young, that it's not an old system. Anyway, we could spend an entire couple of hours really talking about young versus old. I think the evidence is very, very clear as I studied it over the years. One of the big dilemmas that people have are dating methodologies. So, For instance, again, I don't have slides for you on this because it wasn't necessarily something I was intending to talk about, but something was mentioned right when we started, so I thought I would hit a couple of these things very briefly for you. And that is that dating methodologies, there are several different ones. The only ones you ever hear about are the carbon dating, and you've probably heard that. That's only good for a few thousand years. The only problem is that it's still not consistent. You can actually date things that are still alive at 3,000 years old. In fact, that's been proven pretty well, that you can get a snail that is alive. You've grown the snail from baby snails and in a laboratory, and then you can carbon date them, and they date out at 3,000 years old. There's a problem there. There's a problem with that. So you see those kinds of inconsistencies constantly in dating methodologies. There are other dating methodologies like the uranium-lead method and potassium-argon method. All they are is looking at ratios. And so in carbon dating, you're looking at the ratio between carbon-14 and carbon-12. As those are decaying and going from one to the other, you look at the relative balance, and that tells you how old they're supposed to be. It makes some dramatic assumptions. One assumption is that you know how much carbon-14 versus carbon-12 it had to begin with. And of course, if it's thousands of years old, how would we know? Well, you make the assumption that it has the same number that we have. But we know that you can change the decay rate with ultraviolet radiation and temperature and moisture, so it's not a constant rate of decay. And so you have to make the assumption that it started with a certain percentage in order to tell how old it is. This is one of the dilemmas that they have. And they have other ones, parent ions and daughter ions, what came first and that kind of thing. And so the dating methodologies really are not as consistent as people think. Now the other ones, uranium, lead, and potassium argon, date out hundreds of thousands or millions of years in theory. Part of the way that they calibrate those methods, now it's the same thing, it's a balance between the things. Part of the way that they calibrate those is using something called the geologic column, which I think I have a picture in here. There it is. There's my geologic column. Here's a geologic column. So in a science textbook, you would say, you would see that there were all these eras of time, and they named them all these cool things, especially Jurassic, because there's a movie about that. And so you name them all these things, and you find all these index fossils that you think you should have. Like down here in the Cambrian period, you'd have trilobites and all that stuff, and you go up. So the idea would be if we were to dig a hole straight down into the crust of the earth, we would find the oldest stuff at the bottom and the newest stuff at the top. Guess what? That actually never happens. You never find that way. And in fact, what's interesting is that there are depth layers around all over the world. There's a depth layer where you have all of these organisms in the same layer of strata. Why do you think that could be? All over the world, you have all these different organisms that should be separated by hundreds of thousands or millions of years, all that died together. Yeah, there's a giant cataclysmic event, like a flood, that would kill them all. And they all died together. And in sediment, they settled down and they became fossils in rapid succession as the sediments came in on top of them. Otherwise, they would just decay. And so this is why we have so many of the fossils. This doesn't exist anywhere. It's totally make-believe. It should be in a children's book that starts out once upon a time. It's just not real. And in fact, when they do find layers of fossils like this, it's usually inverted. It's upside down. And what should be the oldest is at the top, and what's the newest is at the bottom. And we found pieces of limestone that are like 250 miles long in Yellowstone National Park that have this very thing. And what they've described it as, what happened, why the oldest fossils are on top and the newest ones are at the bottom, is a process called overthrusting. In other words, this 250-mile wide piece of limestone shifted out and up and upside down without breaking. Once upon a time, we told a story and everyone believed it because we used big words that no one knew what we were saying. That's what it is. It's just ridiculousness. So this doesn't work. Now the reason why this is important to you is part of why this doesn't work is that's how they calibrate some of the dating methodologies. They have index fossils that should be certain ages, and so when they assume a certain age, then they can calibrate their dating methodologies based on what the index fossil should be, and it becomes a problem because how can you date something? How can you use a calibration tool on something that is impossible to calibrate because it doesn't exist? This is a problem. This is a problem. And so what scientists do is they make their assumptions on how old something should be based on what it is, based on a make-believe and imaginary strata layer. and then they find the dating methodology that works best for them, and that's how they do it. And they never tell this story. It is a hidden story that is behind the scenes, that all the scientists know that this is how that it works, but no one ever wants to talk about it because it sort of messes up the entire idea. All right, so there's more that we could talk about, but that's just a little snippet and snapshot that I'll try and work in there for you. How about some other things, like Charles Darwin? Why then is not every geological formation and every strata full of such intermediate links? That would be this picture. What Darwin is saying is, in that picture, why aren't there all these intermediate links, but like between fish and frogs and reptiles? We should have hundreds or thousands of different kinds of fossils that are kind of fishes and kind of amphibians and things like that, that they should fit in between. And Charles Darwin saying, why isn't every geological form full of intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against my theory. And that's in The Origin of Species. Darwin knew there were no transitional fossils. None. That the kinds, the Bible talks about kinds. That is, that there's a kind of animal, and here's a kind of animal. The point of that is species. There's species that you can't interbreed. Can you interbreed certain organisms like a tiger and a lion? Can you interbreed them? The answer is yes. And if you're a Napoleon Dynamite fan, then it would be like a liger kind of thing. You can do it, but guess what's amazing about it? They're sterile. Those organisms cannot reproduce, which prove that it's not a new organism. It has to be able to reproduce. And so because it can't, it's blocked out by its own kind. This is part of how God designed it, so that it would be kinds. And so Darwin realized there are no intermediate fossils. This is a problem because my theory necessitates having finely graduated changes over millions or billions of years, that the little fish has a little malfunction in its genetic code, and it's a little different, and the next one's a little different, the next one's a little different, a billion times over, and eventually we get to a frog. It's just not how it works. We, by the way, in the scientific world have tried this with fruit flies. Fruit flies have a very short gestation period. I'm guessing you know that if you've ever bought bananas and just let them sit on the counter for a while. They're everywhere. It's how it goes. They have a short gestation period, so they're great in the laboratory. And we've taken fruit flies and we have exposed them to every chemical and radiation that you can imagine. And although you can make them turn out weird, you cannot make them turn out weird and create weird babies. They just keep producing fruit flies. You may make them gross. In college, I was part of a really intelligent scientific process, research project that we got published, which was called Feeding Deterrency of Tenebrio molitor. Isn't that exciting? Yes, I'm that nerd guy. And what it really meant was we had mealworms that fed on stored grain. We were trying to figure out how to keep mealworms from feeding on stored grain. And so we take mealworms and we expose them to all kinds of heinous materials. In fact, I didn't know what I was working on because it was double-blind study with the chemistry department, which scared me because it was like, should I touch these with my hand? And sometimes they go, no. It was like, okay. Always wear gloves when playing with worms. And so that kind of thing. But they would just be malformed in these mutants. And usually they were too sick to breed. But if they did breed, the babies were still babies. I mean, they were still mealworms. They didn't come out all weird. By the way, this is one of the other theoretical problems that we see that I didn't reference in here. In textbooks, you also have these ideas about, like, giraffes, for instance. They'll be in your textbooks with the giraffes that have short necks, and then over time they stretched out their neck and they would eat the leaves, and then their babies would have longer necks because they stretched out their necks. This is not good science. This Lamarck is the one who came up with this kind of idea. And this is a problem. Lamarckism says that what happens physically to the organism will be passed on genetically to the babies. That doesn't happen. If, again, using the example, if I cut my arm off, guess what? My children are going to have a left arm. It doesn't, the phenotype, the physical expression of the genes is not going to change the genotype, the genetic structure, if something physically happens. And so Lamarck, who is obviously not true, that idea of the giraffe stretching their necks and having babies with longer necks, it's still in the textbooks, and scientists still propagate that kind of lie, that kind of propaganda that absolutely does not work. And so it's an issue. And so really what we have with Darwin's idea is a scientific theory that will also make its way into the textbooks called punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium basically says that these organisms right here, what happened was you had one organism basically laid an egg and out came a new organism. That a fish one day had babies and frogs came out. Or that frogs had babies and a lizard came out. This is really the theory of what's called punctuated equilibrium. Those of us who make fun of people that believe in punctuated equilibrium, I'm one of these people, we also call it the hopeful monster theory. That if we just hope long enough, they might have babies that are really weird. Some of you know that there are some babies that are weird, right? We all say all babies are cute, but then we say bless his heart, and it's just not true. And it's an acceptable lie that we tell, that kind of, I'm just kidding. But no, I'm not really. But with fish, they're not supposed to have frog babies. But punctuated equilibrium, which has become a well-known scientific idea, is in our textbooks because this doesn't exist, and the only way that you can get from fish to amphibian, and amphibian to reptile, and reptile to bird, and bird to mammal is if it had an organism, a baby, and it came out to be completely different, which is an issue. Okay, so let's keep going. How about this? Again, we're talking about scientists who don't believe in their own theory. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. This is Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard. How about this one? The fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. Is it then a science or a faith? L. Harrison Matthews in the intro to Darwin's Origin of the Species. I think that's interesting. That this scientist who wrote in the intro of Darwin's Origin of the Species said, is it really a faith? So I guess the question is, does the Bible define faith for us? Do we get an idea of what that is? Well, Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Evolution is not science, it is faith. It just is. Now, it uses science as a pseudoscience, but it really is a faith. They have a hope for what it is to be, but I will tell you it takes more faith to believe in these evolutionary mechanisms than it does to believe that there's a God who spoke light into existence. And you will have people who will disagree with you, but I'm telling you, I've been on both sides. It takes way more faith to believe it is accidental, mutational development that not even the scientists who write the textbooks believe. It takes way more faith to believe that than there is a supreme power that said, let there be light. And so, how about this one? This is my favorite. When it comes to the origins of life, there are only two possibilities. There's not a third possibility. That of spontaneous generation or that of supernatural creation. Now stop there for a second. Spontaneous generation is the idea that life came from non-life. Darwin's warm little pond. Darwin's warm pond idea is that in the early Earth's atmosphere, the Big Bangs occurred, everything slowed down, congealed together, there's liquid on the planet. By the way, this is why they're so interested in finding life on other planets. Is there water? Because that could be this proof of the evolution that we can't find. And so they would find the warm pond, that's their hope. But the warm pond idea is that all of the building blocks of life were in the warm pond. And so it was a reducing environment, which means there was no oxygen in the early Earth's atmosphere. There was ammonia and methane and lightning. And by the way, lightning breaks hydrogen bonds pretty easy, so water molecules would get broken up and there would be free oxygen. But they never talk about that part. But we had a couple of biochemists many years ago, many decades ago, Urey and Miller were their last names, and they did what's called the Urey-Miller experiment, where they took a reducing environment, no oxygen, methane and ammonia, passed electricity through it, and sure enough, they created some amino acids. Now, amino acids are not alive. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, which eventually form genetic material, which eventually forms life. And again, this is one of those things that if we had more time, it would be another day we could spend together maybe, just talking about statistics. But the probability of creating life out of amino acids is statistically impossible, and it's been proven over and over and over again that there's no possible way it would happen. But in Darwin's theory, spontaneous generation, all these amino acids, adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine, all these things come together in the perfect order, create protein chains, and poof, you've got life. That's how easy they make it sound in the scientific textbooks. But in reality, what they created was tar. They mostly created tar. And of course, there's absolutely zero evidence whatsoever the early Earth's atmosphere was reducing or had methane and ammonia in it at all. But that's what they came up with because it was a biochemist magic trick. They knew how to do this. And amino acids aren't alive. It's just chemical building blocks in order to do it. The other side of that also is there are two kinds of amino acids in the environment that occur naturally. You have right-handed amino acids and left-handed amino acids. And the only kind of amino acids that link up to form proteins are left-handed amino acids. The moment you put a right, so they stack like this and form proteins, which are, again, help getting toward DNA and things. So it's a long way away from DNA. And so only left-handed, even though right-handed ones exist naturally, the moment that a right-handed amino acid comes in and tries to link up, it blows up the protein chain. And so although both occur, and so what they created was both left-handed and right-handed ones, but they certainly did not create protein. But those pictures of Urey-Miller experiment are in every biology textbook. And what's so interesting is on the next page, almost every time, they talk about how Louis Pasteur disproved spontaneous generation 100 years ago. And so they would talk about Pasteur and Spallanzani. For instance, back in the day, they thought that a bag of dirty rags in the corner actually spontaneously generated mice. That mice would evolve out of dirty rags in the corner. Did the mice evolve out of the dirty rags in the corner? No. They lived there. That was what happened. They came in through the floorboard and lived in the dirty rags in the corner. And so they would move the rags, out would come mice, and people really believed these spontaneously generated. On their own, they just came into existence. Or you would set out meat on the counter, and within a few days, what happens? There are maggots on it, and then flies. It spontaneously generated life. No, what they found was that if they put a bell jar over the piece of meat and then they left another piece of meat out on the counter, the piece of meat on the counter grew maggots and flies. Why? Because flies flew and out on the meat and laid eggs, and it was not spontaneous generation. Louis Pasteur and Spallanzani, they disproved spontaneous generation over 100 years ago. And here's exactly what George Wald said. When it comes to the origins of life, there are only two possibilities. There's no third way. That is spontaneous generation or that is supernatural creation. We disproved spontaneous generation over 100 years ago. That leads us to only one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. Don't miss this. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. Please read it again on your own for your own personal pleasure. Dr. George Wald, 1967 Nobel Peace Prize winner in science. At least he's honest. Yeah. They don't believe their own theories. And these are the guys that have written all the textbooks. These are the guys who trained all of the biologists that are out there. You know, it's interesting, you could look at other ones like this, like Huxley said this, which I think is funny. I suppose the reason why we left at the origin of species was that the idea of God interfered with our sexual mores. That really we just don't want to believe in a God. Remember, this is how we began our time together, and I said that part of the problem was with the darkness and this push toward an atheistic, non-created development is that we have no one to answer to. There's no such thing as morality or ethics because we're all just creatures that randomly occurred. And what Huxley says is we don't want to believe in a God because we have someone to answer to, and we have our own sexual mores. We have our own plan, and so it's better to just believe in impossible things. And so how about Charles Darwin? I think maybe you guys have talked about this. Just suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for emitting different amounts of light, for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. The belief that an organ as perfect as the eye could have formed by natural selection is more than enough to stagger anyone. Sturmius, an ancient philosopher, said examination of the eye is a cure for atheism. I would agree with that. Or how about this? Theodore Talmagian from the Energy Commission said, scientists who go about teaching that evolution is a fact of life are great con men. And the story they are telling may be the greatest hoax ever. In explaining evolution, we do not have one iota of fact. It is a tangled mishmash of guessing games and figure jaggling. You see, they've testified against themselves. The scientists who've written the textbooks are expert witnesses that life could not have begun without a creator. And I just gave you a taste of them. There are hundreds of these quotes, hundreds of them, from the most well-known scientists in the world over the last several decades. You know, and there's others, and I don't have time for these. Hoyle and Wickersham, they continue on and they talk about basically that it's absurd when you begin to look at the theories, and these are atheistic biochemists and evolutionists, when they say the probability of life originating at random is absurd and are in every respect deliberate, even to the extreme idealized limit of God. These are not Christians that are writing this. These are people who are writing in magazines like the Scientific American. It comes out of this idea of John Horgan, who says, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Here's what he says: DNA can make neither proteins nor copies of itself with the help of catalytic proteins called enzymes. This fact turned the origin of life into a classic chicken or egg puzzle. Which came first, proteins or DNA? Here's the idea. You need RNA in order to create DNA, but you need DNA to make RNA. And without DNA, you can't have an RNA, but without RNA, you can't make DNA. So how did we get life? We didn't, couldn't we? And then the same thing. How do you get protein without DNA, but how do you get DNA without protein? Something has to start somewhere. And it was because God said, let there be, and there was. And the biochemists don't believe that it could have happened on accident any more than I do. But yet, we have them continuing to say evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe only because the only alternative is special creation. And that is unthinkable. We just refuse to believe it. Everywhere we look is design. And truthfully, I need another hour, but here it is. I'll give it to you quickly. You have examples of things like bombardier beetles. Bombardier beetles are my favorite bug. They're all over the place, and bombardier beetles, and when threatened, can shoot liquid out of their hiney end at almost boiling point temperatures. What's interesting when you look at the anatomy of a bombardier beetle is they have two different sacs inside of their abdomen area. One has basically hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, and the other has hydroquinone, a different chemical. These two then, when it's threatened, mix into a separate channel where a catalyzing enzyme is added, which ignite them, basically, it's not fire, but ignite them to a boiling point, and it can spin this turret around almost any direction, over its head, underneath its body, any side, at boiling point temperatures in a nanosecond. It can do that. Now, can you imagine, just for a moment, if you will, the evolutionary mechanism that would have needed to take place in order for this to happen, for you to have two separate chemicals that this bug is creating on his own, separated in two different chambers, and then you have a third chamber with another chemical that you create, and then you dump these chemicals in at just the right moment with an enzyme that sprays out this chemical at boiling point temperature. Can you imagine how many little bombardier beetles would have exploded over the millions and millions of years as it trying to figure out how to mix the chemicals right? I mean, I can barely boil water at home sometimes, but they're able to make their own chemicals and mix them perfectly at the right moment in time. But over millions of years, it would have been like, hey, look at the bombardier, and it just popped, and it didn't mix it right. It just blew up. Of course, that's ridiculous. That's not how it works. Or how about this? My favorite. This is my favorite. So you have a sea slug versus a sea anemone. Now here's what's interesting. So here's a sea anemone. Now those are not real common as food for organisms because on these little tentacles, they look like this. Now this is a cross section. Inside of each one of these little tentacles, it has a spring-loaded action with a poison sac and a dart. If you even remotely touch one, the spring action goes and it shoots the dart into its enemy, pushing chemicals into it that are poisonous. Now the sea slug is interesting because he loves to eat them. The sea slug emits a chemical that keeps these from exploding, and so he emits a chemical, he envelops the sea anemone and eats it. Now here's the amazing part to me. The sea slug then eats all of the flesh of the sea anemone except for the poison barb sacs, which it's able to digest into its stomach and through ciliated tubes in its own intestinal system, pushes out these little barbs to the edges of his structures and uses his defense system, this mechanism, as his own defense system. And so now when a fish tries to eat this guy, he uses this guy's poison sacs that he ate and digested and pushed out to the end of his little tentacles and uses them as his defense mechanism. Can you imagine the random mutations that made that work? It's just ridiculous. Cellular organelles, I think you guys have talked about this. I won't bore you with the details. Convergence. The idea of flight being an evolutionary mechanism through random mutational events is ridiculous when you think about it happening one time, but how about when it happens in insects and in other organisms all the way through, from birds and mammals, etc. You have the same kind of evolutionary system happening over and over again. Or cleaning symbiosis. You know, they have places in the ocean that they call cleaning stations, and you can have fish that would, or eels that would normally eat shrimp, but they will swim into a particular area, open their mouths, and shrimp will crawl into their mouth and eat out all the parasites between their teeth, and then the shrimp will finish, that organism will swim on, and there's literally another one waiting behind it like a car wash. And they will come in, I'm not kidding you, and they will come in and they will open their mouths. Now if they found them out in the open ocean, that's their food source. They would totally eat them. But there's little pockets in the ocean where they call them cleaning stations, and they will crawl in and out of their gill slits and eat parasites and bugs off their body. And they sit there with their mouth open, allowing it to happen. And you see in other organisms that have the same similar thing. Cleaning symbiosis, write it down, go watch videos. How about reproduction? I can't talk about it, we don't have time. Okay, so you want me to talk about it, I know, because no one ever gets to that section in the textbook. And it's so sad. Here's all I'm going to say about reproduction. And that is, think for a moment about male and female species. In order for it to work, you would have had to evolve both male and female simultaneously at separate times in their own random mutational way. Not only would you have to randomly evolve external sex characteristics, but internal sex characteristics in order for sexual reproduction to occur, and it would have had to happen at the exact same moment in time in order for it to work. And it's not just in us, but in all kinds of animals. This is just ridiculousness in every way. The universe has been fine-tuned. Here it is. In their case, the God of this world has blinded minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel, the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of the darkness," has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. We live in a dark world. We're called to shine that light. So, I hope that you will. I hope that you will allow the truth of God to shine through you, so that this dark world will see that there is a God, that He's crazy about you, He's crazy about your friends. Salvation hangs in the balance for thousands of people who believed a lie, but let God's light shine. And so as you go, take that with you. But also know that God created you with purpose, you are planned, and you are important. And you're important to God as well. So, I am done with our time. We didn't have time for questions. You believe it or not, I skipped like 4 pages of notes. So, there you go.
Can I change what you just said?
Yep.
Let's do this. I know some of you have kids, so you're free to get up quietly and leave. But if there are, we'll take maybe 1 or 2 questions. Mm-hmm. But they have to be questions, not comments. Okay, sometimes this group has comments.
Right, yeah. Tell me a story.
Different kind of question.
Right.
So if you have a question for Spencer, then let's do that. But before we do that, let's give him a hand for being here. You're not only impressed with the material, by the way, but with the speed with which you can communicate. Thank you. Very impressive.
Okay. I only got
and how you evolve that ability is incredible.
Well, and especially with a brain that's only 60% fat. And electrical impulses and chemical. That's true for you too.
Anybody have a question?
I don't know anything about spark of light, but what I've studied it in great detail over the years. But what I do know is that at the moment that crossing over occurs, which is where the genetics of mom and the genetics of dad make a totally unique individual, it absolutely fits all the definitions of life. And so if you were to, from a biological perspective, say, is this blob alive? You would ask certain questions like, does it have heredity or genetics? Does it have cellular organization? Does it have cellular respiration, etc., metabolism? And the answer is that even a single cell fertilized egg fits the definition of life. So that's what I can tell you, but I don't know about a spark of light. It's possible, but I've not studied that.
Any other questions?
Did multi-strike fossils figure into your
Yeah, I think.
flood stuff?
Yeah, I mean, flood stuff is interesting, and I love that, and that's a totally another topic for a couple of hours. But yes, the polystrate fossils and all that stuff are definitely a part of that picture of how do you create fossils quickly. Because the problem is if an animal or anything like that, even plant material, if it lays out on the ground, it decays. And so when you start creating stuff, in order to create fossilization has to occur rapidly. And so that fits in with that kind of stuff. Yeah. And especially with the polystrate, what happens is you have like trees and things that are in multiple layers of strata that should be separated by hundreds of thousands of years old. That's a problem. You can't have one fossil that's existing simultaneously in multiple planes like that. And so that's one of the challenges.
Some of those are upside down, like you said.
Absolutely.
Like around Mount St. Helens.
Right, yeah. And Mount St. Helens and things with uranium, lead, and potassium argon methods, they've dated lava flows at 3 billion years old, which we know when Mount St. Helens happened. And so that should be a geological reset on those rocks. But of course, you can date them after a few decades at 3 billion years old, which just shows that those dating methodologies don't work. Yes?
When did your light bulb go off in going from an atheist to a Christian? What was the
Right.
spark for you?
Yeah, it was a genetics class. And so sitting in genetics class, I was just sitting there listening to the complexity of DNA. And I thought to myself, there's absolutely no possible way this happened on accident. Now, the good news was I was married to a Christian, and so she was picking on me all the time about it anyway. And so, I was thinking about that, but still, what really got me was genetics. That was where it began for me. And I started asking questions like, I'm not sure how we could get that complex and things like that, and asking more specific questions in that first class, even though I really wasn't sure what to ask because I didn't know anything. But they would just yell at me and tell me to shut up. It's pretty much
This is a comment, Marshall. I bet she was praying for you.
Yeah. It's interesting. It makes me emotional every time I say it, so I'll try not to and wreck myself. But one of the things that I've asked our church many times is, who prayed you here? Who prayed you into the hands of the Lord? And I can't wait to get to heaven and find out who was praying for me to have scales fall off my eyes. And I can't wait to find out. I have no idea who, other than Jennifer and her mom. We're definitely praying those prayers over me, but I just wonder who else. But even if it was no one else, that was good. And the scales fell from my eyes. And that's really what happened. It was oh wow, this is not accidental. I better figure out who this creator is. Because creators don't create without purpose. Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Let
Yeah.
me pray over you.
Okay, great.
Pray and we'll be done. And thank all of you for being here. This will be on YouTube. I got Spencer's permission for that. So if you want to go back and hear it again and think through it or tell other people about it, it'll be available there. Father God, thank you so much for, you are amazing. You are an amazing God. We just praise you that it's so evident that we can look into what you have made and see your fingerprints, see your design, and celebrate you as our Creator. Help us to spread that news, the good news of Jesus Christ to all the world. Thank you for the work that Spencer and Jennifer are doing. Bless the Renew Community Church in Cabot. I pray that you would protect them and guide them powerfully through your Holy Spirit and make their work effective for the gospel. Bless their children, Hannah and Jake, and pray that you would be with them in a mighty and bold way. And give them safety as they return home tomorrow. Thank you for the occasion tonight. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.